Preparing live stream.
Okay, cool. All right. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh, the sun is out, Mary. The sun is out.
There we go.
Yeah, okay. All right. I think I found it. I think I found it. I
Mm,
think I'm doing good. All right, almost right on time. Okay, I gotta hit this OK button. All right, here we are. Here we are. So yeah,
right.
so we'll do this. We'll get out to the battlefield today. We'll
Yeah.
do some shenanigans. We'll get out and about. So that'll be cool.
Yes, it's a beautiful day here in Gettysburg.
I know I'm here. Perhaps you didn't notice that I was. Anyway, I'll get going here. So I just gotta figure it out. So yeah, get the morning going. It does feel like the weather is getting better. We talk about the weather all the time, but it is
Yeah.
important. So I
Good
guess.
morning, James and Barbara.
Oh hey, morning, buddy. Good morning, everybody, on yet another Sunday. Today's Sunday, right? Yeah.
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 Our episode yesterday, released it last night around 8:30. It's a
Good.
little bit of a longer episode because we talked about kind of the life of General PGT Beauregard. And with those episodes, they usually end up being about 90 minutes. This one was like around an hour 20.
Yeah, well, when you're talking about somebody, especially a biography type thing, yeah, you want to tell the story. And what's good about like any of these guys, Beauregard, any of these guys, is the background stories, is the
Yeah.
growing up stories. Because you can read about the battles, and that's all well and good. And people, and obviously, people enjoy that. That's why they do these Civil War things. But I like to get into the people a little bit, get in their
Yep.
heads a little bit, kind of getting into their heads and seeing what they're all about. So I think it's cool. Maybe you don't think so, but I think it's cool.
I do. I've been wanting to do an episode about Beauregard for a while.
No, I know. Actually, we have talked about him for a while. He's been somebody who's been on our hit list for quite a bit. So I'm glad we finally did it. But
Oh, he was one of the ones that like the first or like I mean in the early days of Breakfast Club, like at the beginning, we were like, oh, we can call him Beauregard.
well, it's a natural. I mean, he doesn't really
Yeah.
fit. He doesn't really fit the type of the name, though. He's like,
No.
do you remember we were talking about who that was, a Custer.
Yeah.
And we were like, oh, you have this mental impression of him being a party boy, and he really
Yeah.
wasn't. Beauregard's kind of like that. He's a snotty little rich kid who just doesn't want to, play along nice with everybody.
Yeah. Jeffrey says it's with a heavy heart I say congrats, we're in the Four Nations Hockey Championship.
The hat
Thank
now.
you.
Gotta wear the hat now.
Great game. Great hockey.
Yeah. Well, you know something, it is what it is. But I mean, what do you expect when you're the USA coach from Boston University? Of course, they're going to friggin' lose at the end of the day. But anyway, that was what. In all seriousness, I know we'll get to the episode and stuff in a bit. But as far as a pure game mode, you're not going to get a better sporting event than that. As far as I have a lot of friends who, because it was played in Boston, a lot of people who were at the game said it was out of all the experiences they've ever been to with any big Patriot game, any big Bruin game, whatever, that was the best. So hey, good. I mean, good for the NHL. Good for the people who do it. It definitely hit at the perfect time with U.S. and Canada. And so I think that was good. That was fun. Yeah, definitely worthwhile. And you went to bed for even ended.
I was tired. I was like, I can't. It was too stressful. So I was like, whatever. So Frank says, morning, let us remember Cavalry General James H. Wilson, who died 100 years ago today.
Okay. All right. Good James Wilson.
Wow, that's like that 1925. That's a long time after the war. Wow. He must have been young before.
Yeah, well, people lived to be in the 50s in the war, Mary. Not everybody is all road as Howard. Dies in the early 1900s. I know you think the war ended when he died and everything else is irrelevant, but there were some more people. I don't know if you know that.
I do study outside the bubble of Howard.
Oh yeah, you certainly, absolutely. I'm sure you do. Absolutely. That's good. So anyway, the Beauregard thing was interesting because he's a big name, right? He is. We like to talk about some of the lower level people sometimes, but he's a big guy, and I just think it's amazing, and it's 100+ years later, and how people like Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard exist today in our regular work lives, because everybody, it might even be you at Mary, but everybody has someone they work with who doesn't like authority, thinks they're the smartest person in the room, all that on especially social media or in their jobs. When you study someone like him, it's hard not to in your head imagine people like that. And that's what makes the story even
I've
funny.
definitely had people in my work life like that. That'll be like, kind of like, well, I think you should, do it this way, or I would have done it that way, kind of. And that's like, all right, I get it. But or they don't offer how they would have done it. Like Beauregard sometimes did that too. And he was like, well, I would have done it this way. Like,
Well, and he obviously, because he and Davis hated each other, and it was
yeah,
funny because he was good, so you had to keep bringing him back. And then Davis realized, oh wait, I forgot what a jerk this guy is. I'm going to bump him again. This guy got fired like 5 or 6 different times, and then Davis would bring him back. So, oh, I need this guy back. He brings it
yeah,
back. Then he remembers why he fired him in the first place and gets rid of him again. I mean, he's going to the newspapers instead of writing post battle reports. He's writing to the place like the Mobile Register and saying,
yeah.
here's how great I did. And Davis, have you ever heard from him? It's funny because he just, I mean, zero F's given is who he
Yeah.
was.
Oh yeah, he didn't care, and he's still a fascinating individual. And I think it would have been interesting had he been put in command a little bit more, had he not, his ego kind of got the best of him. The one thing we said in the episode is he is like the Confederate version of McClellan
Oh,
in many
exactly.
ways. But like the whole what was it? Like the whole thing with Davis is really the underlying thing with Beauregard in the Civil War, the hatred they had for each other, to the point where Beauregard is like, I'm not going to this guy's funeral because he's a jerk, kind of
I
thing.
mean, he hated, yeah, and he wrote about it. He hated Davis. He didn't respect Davis. The parallels to McClellan are astoundingly accurate. I mean, it's the same dude. It's
Yeah.
like that Spider-Man meme. They're pointing at each other, right?
Yeah.
That's who they were. So, and that's the real shame of it is if Beauregard or somehow McClellan ended up on the same side, how that would have gone.
Oh, that's
I mean, because when you have someone like Grant and Sherman, they got along well because
yeah.
Sherman acquiesced to Grant and he was happy to
Mhm.
be his Robin, his Batman.
Yeah.
They would have been that would have been a real thing because just like with McClellan and Lincoln, he had no respect for Davis as an authority. He
Yeah.
felt that he made the decisions. Think about it. You're sitting in Charleston and you're defending Charleston. You're the
Yeah.
only Confederate general to have any success in 1863. This is Beauregard. And you start writing letters to other commanders saying, here's where you suck. Here's what you should do to make it better. And you're getting these letters like, are you kidding me? He's like, well, I would have done that. I would, and he's bashing people like Lee. And of course, he doesn't get along with Braxton Bragg because Bragg was his superior in a couple different times. But you can just see he hated the fact that he's sitting there and in his defense, he does a great job defending Charleston
Mhm.
from DuPont, from Gilmore, the
Yeah.
54th Mass, that whole deal. He defends the city. Meanwhile, in '63, Gettysburg is happening. Vicksburg is happening. All these
Yeah.
things are going down.
Chickamauga. Yeah.
Chickamauga, right? But I mean, but Chickamauga was successful though. But I mean, Chattanooga, you see a lot of negative things happening in other parts of the war, and you're sitting there going, everything I touch turns to gold in my mind.
Yeah.
I need what you need to do is what I would do and do this.
Yeah.
And he sends Bragg a simple 5-step plan to win Chattanooga, and he sends
Which
it to
didn't
him.
include like celebrate.
Yeah, no, number 4 is win and celebrate. It's hilarious. Okay,
Yeah.
but I mean, and then number 5, of course, is now we're all heading to Virginia to go take care of Grant in the East and all that. But that's how he was. He was the
Yeah.
guy. He's the guy in your office who sits in those meetings and hates the boss because he thinks he should be the boss.
Yeah.
He's lazy. He doesn't do anything. And when something bad goes wrong, he blames somebody else. But he has just enough success, just enough
They
where
never gets
they
like
keep bringing him back, right?
yeah. William Hammond asked what caused the hatred between Davis and Beauregard.
What started the hatred?
Yeah, like what? Like there was one event that kind of started it, right?
Well, if you go back to the very beginning, it was just basically how he defends initially. He's in charge of Charleston, Fort Sumter, the whole deal, right? And he's very successful. He gets put in charge. He mans Castle Pinckney, Fort Moultrie, all the battles, and they win. They fire on Sumter and they win. There's a fort in Florida and Pensacola called Fort Pickens, right? And that is kind of a much more difficult fort to defend and take. The Union held it, and the Confederates wanted it. But the Confederates had no navy at the time. So he asked Beauregard, hey, can you work your magic and you can go take Fort Pickens like you did Sumter? And basically Beauregard says, yeah, I'm not going to be doing that because there's no chance of success. We have no navy, and that's a
Yeah.
complete waste of time. So I'm gonna have to go to say no to that. I don't want to participate. And that was the first time Davis like, oh,
All right.
That wasn't really, I wasn't, we don't take requests on the station, Beauregard, but I think, and so he refused to do it. And at that point, he's like, okay. And then it goes on and on and on. Then you get to Shiloh, right? So you're sitting there, they're sitting around back in Montgomery there, and they're trying to say, well, we need to deal with Shiloh. And actually they were back in Richmond at this point.
Yeah.
And he's like, Beauregard, go to Shiloh, go to Manassas Junction. Can't forget Manassas. That's where it starts. And he gets up there and says, I cannot defend this. I don't have enough people. I don't have enough arms. We have no uniforms, nothing. So you can send me more people. I'd like to get maybe Joseph E. Johnson's garrison at Harper's Ferry, because that'd be cool. Because I did 6,000 men, and there's at least 30,000 Federals that McDowell has, who I went to school with and also hated. Yeah. So it'd be nice if maybe you could send me them. And Davis is like, nah. He's like, well, in that case, I'm going to have to retreat then. And he would do things like that. When he wanted transports, Davis never responded to him. So he goes to the 7th Virginia, commanded by James Kemper. Gettysburg people know him, to go use your political friends in Virginia to get us some stuff. So he starts getting materials from locals, bypassing the chain of command. And Davis is like, this dude thinks he's this guy, he's the man.
In a way, I don't blame him, because he's seeing that they're going to fight a battle, and Davis isn't seeing what he's seeing. And again, it goes back to that, like, just kind of trust me. And, Davis, obviously, I think he wanted to be commanding an army, not
he did.
Not what he was doing.
He admitted as such to that. He wanted to be in the field. Because this is a guy. It's easy to sit here in a chair. I don't get that. Kind of like Halleck did. He wanted to be the man. Yep. But every
morning, Andrea.
Oh, hey, Andrea. Great day to walk the battlefield, Andrea. Just get out there and do it. We'll do it. But for the most part, anytime he needs a guy, because after Charleston, and it can't be understated with this, he was a superstar in the South. This is Beauregard.
Yeah.
Everything Robert E. Lee would become later, was Beauregard then. I mean, he was an absolute rock star. But the thing about it is he started to read his own press clippings. He had a little bit of arrogantia, as they say, right?
Yeah, he was very arrogant.
Because he came from a rich family, a rich military family. He grew up hearing stories of his relatives fighting in England, and so he felt he was put on this earth for military success.
Yeah. Well, that's because his hero was Napoleon, because when he went to school in New York, starting at the age of 12, his two of his instructors had fought with Napoleon, and they had been in his army, and they would tell stories, and Beauregard became obsessed with Napoleon, and that's what he wanted. Like, the newspapers would write, like, he seems like a Napoleon in gray. And that's what Beauregard wanted, was that kind of, he wanted to be Napoleon. And people said he acted like him too. Like, he took on kind of like who his hero was, he was trying to become, obviously. But I getting back to the point of like what he's having to do with like getting the uniforms for the army, and how he comes up with that, like, tying a piece of cloth around the arms so they could recognize them. Lee was having to do similar things early in the Civil War too with the Virginia militia. He was trying to organize that. He realized, like, oh, we don't have like proper uniforms. We don't have, he's having to do similar things as well, because they're getting thrown into this, both sides, Federals and the Confederates, without any kind of organization. You look at Sherman at First Manassas, right before he goes into battle, he is looking in a military handbook to see, like, well, what formation do I need to put my guys in this thing? Like, that's how amateur it is at the very beginning.
Of course it is. And there was no great shakes in the Union military either. I mean, West Point was, it was an engineering school at that point for the most part. It wasn't like it is now, but for the most part, you obviously had volunteers on both sides. You saw how badly the Union, how they fought at First Manassas. But again, the issues Beauregard was bringing up were real. But again, you just can't go to the factory and roll out uniforms at that point of the war for the Confederacy. So you had to be a little bit understanding or tolerant. Now, he wasn't wrong. He had 6,000 men at Manassas, the junction there, and he was right that McDowell could probably bring out about 25 to 30,000 minimum. Yep. So he wasn't wrong about that. If you're going to put me in charge of this vital junction that connects the rail line to Southern Virginia, at least give me the damn tools,
Yeah.
and let him choose. There was an old football coach who used to say, if you're going to let me cook the meal, let me shop for the groceries,
Yeah.
right? And he wasn't wrong about that. Is you have to be able to pick who you want. He wanted Joseph E. Johnson, but that meant evacuating Harper's Ferry. Ultimately, it happened, and Johnson was pissed about that,
Yeah.
and so was people like Jeb Stuart pissed about that. And Harper's Ferry got passed around a little bit as it went on, but he, in his mind, I'm going to win the war right now. I started the war in Charleston. We're going to win it here at Manassas. I'm going to be the hero. I'm going to be the American Napoleon. That's how he saw himself. And it started to play that way. But then what happens? Joseph E. Johnson gets all the credit because who fights with him is Stonewall Jackson and those guys. So when you think of the Battle of First Manassas, who do you think of, right? You think of Jackson.
Yeah.
You don't think of Beauregard. And he hated that. And he was reminded of that often.
Yeah.
That it was
you're right about that.
Joseph E. Johnson he wasn't a look at me type guy. But Davis doesn't really like Beauregard and says, something, I think I'm gonna give credit to this guy. He does the same thing with Major Stephen Elliott in Charleston later in the war.
Yeah, he will never give credit to Beauregard at all. And like that, so like after the win or like after Manassas, Lee wrote both to Beauregard and Johnston and congratulated them on their win. And Lee kind of took I don't know, he put something subtle in there like, well, I kind of wish I had been there, but I'm back here in like Richmond or wherever, and wasn't able to get there. It's like, it's because you're not like, you've been assigned to a desk, Lee.
Yeah, well, I mean, Lee was criticized by Beauregard after the 7 days. He writes a letter, because what Beauregard would do is he would write letters to newspapers, and that's what got a lot of people pissed off. He would go to the media. He wrote that Robert E. Lee, despite winning the 7 days battles, bungled it all. He violated a cardinal rule of warfare by breaking up his army. I would have done this. I would have done better. That's who he was.
Well, that's it, because Beauregard could not break free of the Napoleonic. He was obsessed with Napoleonic tactics because of Napoleon, and he was not able to break free of that. And when you had to go off textbook, and it happened in Mexico, that it was either Taylor or Scott was going to go off book for some kind of maneuver in the Mexican War, and Beauregard could not, like, it did not compute with him. Like, he was like, no, we can't do that.
Well,
it's not.
But just put yourself in Beauregard's shoes for a second, especially early in the war. You get placed in charge of Charleston, and you fire on Fort Sumter. You start the war. You drive everything back. You're the hero, and now your head's being filled with stuff, right? And now you end up, okay, didn't work out too well with Davis, but he's going to send me now to Manassas. We're going to win that too. We're going to send the Union scurrying back. It's going to be a big, big deal. I think I won that. He gets mad at me. He sends me to Trans-Mississippi to go work with Albert Sidney Johnston. Shiloh, he's in Corinth. I think I'm going to sneak my men across to Pittsburgh Landing, beat Grant before he can formulate with Buell. He does it. It just falls apart the second day. So when you're sitting on April 6th of 1862 and you've just driven back Grant's army to the to the Pittsburgh Landing, Buell hasn't arrived yet. You don't think he's going to make it in time. You're going to finish them off the next day. Of course you're going to think you're a king. Of course, because everything you're touching at that point is turning to gold. But unfortunately, what happened, everybody knows what happens the second day of Shiloh.
Yeah.
That's what humbled him. And then he falls back to Corinth again. And unfortunately, because of the water and the contamination, they all got typhoid, they all got dysentery, they all got sick. He had to retreat from Corinth and give up that vital rail junction. So now you got back-to-back losses, and your star is waning. And Davis is like, see, I told you this guy sucks. I keep trying to tell you.
Except he doesn't suck. He's really good. He just has an ego on him. And Davis and he don't get along, and Davis doesn't like that. And Jeffrey says, like, I think you're right. He seems driven from an early age to believe he is destined for military greatness, and appointments like West Point and early war success may have only fed into that delusion. I definitely agree with that. And like, the thing with West Point is his family, especially his father, did not want him to go there. They felt it was like, I think it was just a little bit too American for him. And they were, even though they were Americans, they still had that French Creole, and that's when Beauregard goes to West Point, that's when he drops the name Pierre. He tries to go by Peter for a while, and that doesn't work. So for the rest of his life, he will sign his GT Beauregard. He
Yeah.
goes by Gustav.
And and he's been hearing, he goes to New York City and he ends up with a mentor who kind of fills his head full of more. This is when he was a teenager,
Yeah.
about around 15 or 16. This is before West Point now.
Yeah,
And
the school where the guys had fought with Napoleon. And
yeah,
always told stories.
and so now he's thinking to himself, I'm destined for military greatness. And he had success in Mexico. I mean, he as a young, a young major, he's giving ideas to Winfield Scott and guys like
Yeah.
Joseph Totten on what they should do. And they say, well, I don't think so. I don't know, Davy, right? But they
Yeah.
do it and it works. I go, shit, this guy is an engineer, but he's a strategist. And he knows what he's doing.
Yeah.
And he's getting all these letters from guys like Winfield Scott saying how great he is. And so it feeds the monster. But the reality was he was good. He was, but I think he didn't realize you got to play in the sandbox well with others.
Yes.
Right. Especially people who are your bosses.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what gets a lot of people. I mean,
Yeah.
think about it. You can sit there at your job all day, be the greatest person at your job, probably spend all day on Facebook, but that's another story. But you can do all that. And if you do well, you're going to think you're destined for bigger things. And if your boss above you is someone who you think isn't that good, you're not going to respect that person. And it's going to continue to feed into it as you have success. I mean, you don't need to be Dr. Phil to figure this one out. I mean, that's just what it was. Yeah. But it came to bite him in the butt.
Yeah.
But because he was successful, he kept getting put back in charge.
And then also at the end of the war, there's not very many high-ranking Confederates that have had the experience that can do it. So they're running out. I do wonder, I mean, the what if is like, after Atlanta fell, there was a point where Davis was thinking of taking Hood out and putting Beauregard in. And I do wonder what would have happened if that had been the case.
Well, I mean, but that's the fascinating thing too, is because Davis meets with Lee and says, all right, what do you think about Beauregard? And they're both like, oh God, you know what? Yeah, he probably is the guy. Okay, fine. But you've got John Bell Hood, peeking in the window. Hi, Jeff, it's me. I think you look great today. Do you think could I do it? And so he's like, all right, I'll give it to Hood. But he puts Beauregard in charge of Hood.
Yeah.
So he kind of says, I know you want field command. He wanted either command after Atlanta, or he wanted to work with Lee and go to the Valley, the job that Early ultimately got with Monocacy and all that stuff. So he ends up basically being in command of Hood's army, an army that ranges from the Mississippi River to Georgia. So he actually gets a higher paid gig. He is, along with Davis, one of the architects of the Nashville-Franklin campaign.
Yeah.
And then it falls apart and it ends up being blamed, not on Hood, but on Beauregard, which is why he gets fired again and sent to Carolina to work with Joseph E. Johnson.
But isn't there a point where Hood goes to tell Beauregard what he wants to do, and Beauregard
laughs at him. He laughs because Beauregard has a plan he wants to do. And this is what you're going to do. I'm right, you're wrong. Okay. But at the end of the day, Beauregard sort of acquiesces him a little bit, lets him decide what he wants to do.
Well, I think it was tough for Hood, or tough for Beauregard, because he's like the overall commander. But Hood would not write him anything. He went over top of him and was talking directly to Davis. So it was more like I don't want to say ceremonial, but it was like, you have power, but not really, like we're saying you do with this position, but really you don't, because Hood's not going to communicate with you.
Well, I think a lot of it too, in talking to Franklin, I think, people learn by their examples. Well, you don't, but most people do. But I mean, like, no, but think about it. You're the Battle of Shiloh. And you had Grant beat, but you lost because you allowed Grant and Buell to merge.
Yeah.
One of Twin Powers activate, right? And then you got smoked. So now he sees Schofield heading towards Nashville. And he's thinking, this is deja vu all over again. If I can beat Schofield before he gets to Nashville, it's Shiloh again. So that's why he chases Schofield so bad. But of course, it blows up in his face. He gets to Nashville, and the same exact thing happens in Nashville as it does in Shiloh. He gets annihilated. Yeah. But I think it's interesting, though, because the plan wasn't a bad plan. It just, there's a million reasons why that whole thing fell apart. But he ends up taking the blame for it. This is Beauregard now.
Yeah.
And he's told, you're going to work as the Robin to Joseph E. Johnson's Batman. You're going to have no combat role. You're going to basically sit in the back seat with your seatbelt on. You're going to shut up and you're going to run the war out. It's kind of what he does. And of course, Borger doesn't take that too well. And he just, but that's kind of what he does. So he does stay in the game, but it just seems like he was an easy whipping boy and a blame for Davis because he hated him. And most people, if there's someone in your life you don't like and something goes wrong and you can take a shot at them, especially you're the boss, you're going to do it.
Yeah.
So you can't blame Davis for it. But Beauregard, unfortunately, like many people, his mouth was his worst enemy, and his ego was his worst enemy.
Much like McClellan.
Yeah. I mean, McClellan, like I said before, the parallels. If you want to write a book about those two together, it's the same guy. It's literally the same guy.
Yeah.
But they just, it's a lesson to be learned.
Very similar in the way they were raised, like very, like, I think entitled.
Yeah.
But I mean, I enjoy studying both of them. I I think McClellan gets a lot more blame than what he.
Well, because he went up against Lincoln. I mean, that's justifiably so. I mean, you both go against the president. One ends up as an iconic American hero. One ends up, sitting in a jail, running out his days, and that's how it is. Yeah. If the South had won the war, that maybe Beauregard is even more vilified in the South for going at Davis. Yeah. Because, like you said a little while ago, he was offered to be part of the procession in Richmond for his funeral. Yeah. Not only did he say no, he wrote a scathing letter saying, "No way am I going to this," paraphrasing. Yeah. And if I did go, I'd be a hypocrite. I hate the guy. So he stood to his guns and he blamed Davis. He blamed Davis for being the speed bump in his career to become Napoleon, is what it was. Yeah. And he never forgave Davis for it. He tunes a lot of his own mistakes out, but he's tunnel vision that way, right?
Yeah. Frank asked, did McClellan and Beauregard ever meet? If so, were they BFFs?
I don't know if that's a good question. I don't know if I'm sure at some point along the way they would have probably met, but it's tough to say.
They might have in Mexico, right?
Yeah, I mean later on. That's a good. We have to look that one up, Frank. That's a good one. But I mean, if they did, I mean, they would have simpaticos probably. It depends. I mean, it's at least an ad. I mean, you know how it is. Sometimes sometimes opposites attract. So maybe not. Beauregard was close with guys like Jubal Early and John Bell Hood down the stretch too. And they were kind of complete opposites. So it's who knows. But it'd be fun to hear. You go back in time, you get Miss Cleo and her crystal ball, and you bring them back to life and hear them talk about the war. I bet that'd be fun. I bet you that'd be a good time.
They would have a different version than everybody else, I'm sure.
No, but again, both of them felt that they were not entrusted, that they knew more than the president, that if they were allowed to do what they wanted, they would have won. And the only reason why they're not national heroes is because they were held down by the man. So, I mean, on that regard, they're the same guy. Of course, they're different things, but exactly.
No, the parallels are very interesting between the two. Mm-hmm. And I mean, Beauregard is one that kind of just, he's got early success at the beginning of the war, and then it just kind of wanes. He's kind of like roller coaster, like he has success again in 63 and then goes back down again and then kind of starts rising again in 64, but he keeps getting fired. And he's a great study. And like, I think it was T. Harry Williams wrote a really good biography about him that I read last year. And it's a little bit dated. I think he needs an updated bio. And I think Emerging Civil War has one in their series about Beauregard, which is more updated biography. But still, the biography is really good. It's got a lot of the stories of him when he was a kid.
Yeah.
That's where I got the story that he was dating Winfield Scott's daughter at one point, and that didn't work out because Scott didn't want them to be together. So again, kind of like McClellan and Hill, except McClellan ended up winning that one.
Yeah, no, I can only imagine what his daughter must have looked like. Imagine
Scott's.
I don't know, but if similar family backgrounds. I mean, again, Beauregard, that two-time Beauregard family was elite of the elite in Louisiana. Yeah. I mean, they really were. And we've talked a lot about some of these people, these guys who come from nothing, but he didn't come from nothing. I mean, this is a privileged, spoiled, rotten little kid.
Yeah.
And he just wicked temper. Beat the hell out of his uncle when he was 9 years old with a stick for teasing in front of his family. I mean, that's just the way he was. But he was also very, very smart. He picked up English fluently when he moved to New York City.
Yeah, when he was only
Um,
12, but he probably spoke with a accent.
Yeah, of course he did. I mean, he grew up with a slave boy named Baptiste, who was best friend growing up, and he
Yeah.
says he's a great storyteller. His nurse was a slave, and she claimed right up until after the Civil War that she considered Pierre her son.
Mhm.
They were that close. So he was somebody kind of like your boy Howard, grew
Yeah.
up with a kid of African. And of course, he wasn't a slave, but I mean, still, so I think he had a fondness or an understanding
Yeah.
that, despite what other people think, like the SD Lees of the world,
Yeah.
that these are
STD.
right. But these are folks. That's why he was such an advocate after the
Yeah.
war of Black civil rights and things like that. So I think he saw them as people more than anything.
Yeah.
But he did grow up in that attic. He did grow up, with in a sugarcane plantation, what's known as Contreras Plantation now in New Orleans, down in that area, down in St. Bernard, and that was his background.
Mhm.
So he didn't see the war as really against slavery. He
Yeah.
saw as he was a very, very big states' rights guy.
Yeah.
But again, I kind of got the impression just by reading a lot of his stuff that it was the slaves and his family weren't like some of these really horrible stories, despite
Yeah.
the fact they were a shitty experience. So I think he kind of thought I think he thought it was more mild than it really really was, and I think
Yeah.
that kind of fixed his head a little bit. Um, but again, at the end of the day, he was fighting for Louisiana's independence in his head. But
Yeah.
then once the states' rights thing turned into a strong Confederate strong government, he realized he was going to be fighting for Virginia and other places. He
Yeah.
got it. I think he never thought until after Franklin that they were going to lose the war. I don't think it ever snuck in his head they'd actually lose this.
Yeah.
I think he thought it was a question of when
Yeah.
versus if. And that's why he was so bitter. He refused to take the amnesty oath for years afterwards.
Yeah.
I
But
think
eventually he did at the urging. I think it was Lee and Davis were like, dude, you got to do
you know,
this.
but I think, he did. I mean, Lee finally got him to do it. Then was, July 4th under Johnson, he was part of the mass parole. But again, he was, I think he was someone who just felt like he was put on this earth for a reason, and that was the reason. And it was, God's will type thing. And he just felt everything was going to be okay.
Yeah.
Don't worry, be happy type thing. I think that's how he saw it. And he hated the fact that he felt there was someone above him meddling that was denying his destiny.
Yeah.
And it's clear when you read the letters about how he will tell everybody how much he hates Davis. I mean, he openly, publicly, he'll write to the newspaper.
Oh yeah, he'd be like, I hate this guy. This guy's a jerk.
He'll tell them that, Shiloh, everything. And then of course Davis, because they're kind of the same guy in a lot of ways too, decides he needs to take him down a peg. I'm going to start blaming him for everything and minimizing his successes because he's getting big for his britches here. And it just never ended. The war ends, they lose, they never forgive each other until the very end. So there you go.
MJ said, good morning. She's on here. And AQ said, Arabella Griffith Barlow knew Scott's daughter, and they traveled together from Burlington, New Jersey to Philadelphia for the celebration after the Mexican War.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
We might have talked about old Pierre. You never know.
You keep saying in the episode, like whenever he would get together, they probably talked about Scott's daughter.
Oh yeah, probably. Just sitting around passing notes around, Just glad that old, AP Hill wasn't involved. Passing prescriptions around, But no, but he's a fascinating character insofar as he's a lot like so many people. Like, and he's look, there's not a lack of people in either army who felt that they were the man. They all did.
Oh, they all had some kind of ego.
But that's why they got to the level they got, though. You don't get to be a major general or at that level without you're thinking you're infallible. Because nobody wants a general who thinks they're going to lose, right?
Yep. That's very true. No, that's very true. James asked, how did PGT get on with the rest of the cabinet?
Same for the most part. The problem with the cabinet is, I mean, at the beginning, he was loved by guys like Judah Benjamin, thought he was great. People like that. Leroy Walker, the first Secretary of State, thought he walked on water. They loved him. But as it went on, you've got Davis. The thing about it, though, is as much as Judah Benjamin and these guys, Stevens, we can talk about it. It was really Davis and Lee who really made a lot of the strategy stuff, and they both did like Beauregard because they both
Yeah.
thought that he was too big.
I mean,
but
Lee
again,
did congratulate him after Manassas, but I think this, the story of PGT and Davis is one that you hear over and over in the Civil War of how these personal rivalries, and it happens on Union side too, are getting in the way of, someone being promoted, someone like something happening at a battle. Like you look at Halleck, how much he did not personally like Grant and would go at him. And then you look at somebody like Grant post Shiloh, who needed a scapegoat. So they go after Lew Wallace. And for like, really, in my opinion, it was for no reason other than they needed a scapegoat, because you can't go and blame Sherman for getting caught off guard, which he did at Shiloh.
Well, Sherman wasn't Sherman at Shiloh either.
No, he wasn't. No, I'm not saying like, but you don't really hear as much criticism towards him as you do. And we talked about that in the Lew Wallace episode, that, it was mainly what's his face, Grant's little lapdog, the guy I don't like at all.
Rollins?
Yes.
How can you remember his name, by the way? You always forget his name.
I don't know. Probably because I don't like him and I try to erase him from my memory.
That's good.
That's really harsh, I know, but I don't like Sean Rollins at all.
You have such anger inside of you.
I don't like him.
No, but no, that's a lot of it too, though. Again, it's all ego. But I mean, if I'm a Confederate soldier, I want to fight under Beauregard because I want a guy who's confident. I want a guy who's I want a guy who's
reputation.
Right. But I want a guy, if I'm sitting at Shiloh, I want a guy who is fighting for my supplies, worried about my uniform of not getting, because my uniform is a uniform to tie a thing on, so a handkerchief, so I can tell the difference, so I don't get shot by my own men. Yeah. I want a guy who wants to build a cartridge factory in Manassas because there's no ammo. I want a guy who's going to reach out to James Kemper, the 7th Virginia, to get transports, and not worry about the government red tape.
Yeah.
But again, if you're the government and you are the red tape, he's an adjutant, is what he is. He's a pain in the ass, right? And so that's why guys like McClellan were loved by their men. And Beauregard was loved by their men because they were, in their mind, they're fighting for the common soldier. And they don't care about the governmental red tape and bureaucracy that's holding them down. Yeah. And that's why these guys are so popular. And that's why a lot of the people in today's society are so popular, because they're deemed to be rebels against the system, whether it's true or not. But that was the case with them. It absolutely was the case with them. I've never read a bad soldier story about Beauregard.
No,
for the most part.
I was just like, you read some of the soldier stories about McClellan, like.
I mean, this is a guy.
What's his name? Like,
what's
go
that?
ahead. Go ahead.
This was a guy at Manassas who was riding with his men in front of the line. This is a guy at Shiloh who, during the second day when things were falling apart, said, "I'm either going to win this war or battle or die trying." And he rode with his horse in front of the Union line, expecting to be killed because I can't live and lose, like, because it's after what happened. So his men saw him. There's an old friend, that old saying, "The men must see me." Right.
Yeah.
And that's who he was. You can say a lot of things about PGT Beauregard, but he wasn't a coward. He didn't fight from the rear.
No.
But
he gets criticized for being at the rear in the Savannah at Shiloh, like for the first part of it until Albert Sidney Johnston gets killed. But then when he finds out Albert Sidney Johnston's gone down, he comes right up.
Right.
But I mean, I've never quite understood that criticism, because to me, you've got to have someone back there. You can't have both your commanding generals up in front, because if it would be like, what was that battle where they all went down in like 5 minutes of each other? Was it Pea Ridge?
Yeah.
Where
they all
out in front and they all got shot.
And they all got shot. I mean, and frankly, you can look at that whole thing too. But again, he's literally sitting in Sherman's tent on April 7th, sitting in his tent, right? God knows what he's doing when everything falls apart. And you can only imagine, because the night of the 6th, you're sending your spike the ball letter. This battle's won. Yeah. He probably already had it pre-written because that's how he was. And then he had to deal with the reality. Oh my God, this whole thing fell apart because my decision to fall back. And that letter he wrote, when he gave the orders to fall back to Braxton Bragg, Bragg literally responded, "My God, my God." That
Yeah.
was his response to it. Braxton
Th-
Bragg's ripping on you, Mary. I don't know. Right?
That's bad. He's not
But
ripping on himself, apparently.
no,
Um,
but that's how it was. And the thing about it though is that he doesn't get, for the things you get blamed for if you're a general, primarily retreating, right? One of his highest moments is retreating out of Corinth, because you fall back to Corinth and
yeah.
everyone gets sick because of the bad water, and Henry Halleck is now in charge because Grant gets put in the corner. He's lucky that Halleck takes the entire month of May
Mhm.
to put his troops together to go ahead and take Corinth, and he
Yeah.
slides out of there with a sick army. People don't realize the Confederates lost more men to illness at Corinth than in the battle at Shiloh. That's how
Yeah.
bad it was. He got out of there and saved his army, but again, that was the final straw the first time,
Yeah.
for him with Davis, because your job was to not lose Corinth no matter what you do. Now you lose Shiloh. Albert Sidney Johnston is dead. And then he sends Albert Sidney Johnston's son, Davis does, to go spy on him. So he was probably hating on Beauregard, because from
Yeah.
just human nature. So you can see the political dominoes lining up against him.
Yeah.
And he was too slow politically to realize what was going on.
Yeah. He wasn't good. He couldn't read the room when it came to politics. I do love the story though, like going back to Shiloh and the tent thing. The letters Sherman writes after Shiloh to his wife and one daughter, he is just like he is so angry with Beauregard, and he's acting like I don't blame him. He's acting like it was like reading something a teenager, like they've lost something. But so Shiloh happens, Sherman gets pushed back, doesn't have time to gather up his tent. Beauregard finds it, and I'm sure he figures out whose tent it belongs to. He obviously knows. Well, the two of them had a bit, like they were friends, but they were also rivals. Like apparently Beauregard, according to Sherman, was one of the ones that wrote him a letter of recommendation for being in charge of the Louisiana State Seminary. So what would become LSU. Or what was it called? Did I get that? Not Louisiana State Seminary. Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. So I was right.
It was a seminary, but it's all right.
What would become LSU? But then, so
Germans, forget it. He's rolling. Keep going.
But so then
You don't
Sherman.
even know what that quote even is from. It's so sad.
Anyway,
How do you not know that?
Can I finish my story?
I'm listening.
So in his memoirs, Sherman, in the first version, Sherman writes, yeah, Beauregard wrote me a letter of recommendation. And then Beauregard apparently wrote him a letter and was like, no, I didn't. I did not. He started denying it. So that's when Sherman had to go back in the second edition, and he wrote the introduction where he's like, this is my version of the events. It might not agree with what some people think. So he takes a shot at Beauregard for Beauregard calling him out. But the Shiloh thing, so he writes to his wife and daughter separately. And he's like, well, lost my tent, lost all my stuff. They basically took everything that wasn't nailed down. I don't know when I'm going to get it back. I'm sleeping outside. And then he gets to go back there, and they took his bedroll. And he was like, I don't even have a bedroll now.
Yeah.
And his wife, I guess, had written him she was like asking for more money. And he's like, I don't have money to send you right now because I need to buy myself a new bedroll. By the way, if you need food, grow a garden. Like he tells her to grow a garden because he's like, I don't know if we can afford food right now because I have to buy myself a new bedroll. Like he was just, it was hilarious to see him, how much he was freaking out. And I think he was more bothered by the fact that Beauregard was in his tent than anything else.
Well, I mean, of course, you don't want the big man in your tent.
Could you imagine Beauregard gets in there? He's like, yeah, I got Billy's tent.
Right. Again, it would have been cooler if it was following, Atlanta or something. But again, if Sherman was still Sherman, he wasn't quite Sherman yet, but people knew who he was, and he was.
Yeah,
he certainly.
But it's a funny story.
Oh, it's a great. Like... That's the whole. Honestly, the Civil War is all great stories. That's all it is. And when you're going to a presentation or you're reading, those are the ones that stick with you anyway. It's the stories. I mean, it's great as this guy flanked this guy. It's all crap, but it's really the personal stories that are fun. And so that's why I've always resonated that stuff. And I think we talk a lot about these people as people. Yeah. I love the story of how Beauregard as a kid beat up his uncle with a stick for teasing. Because you know what? Everybody has an uncle who was like that. There's not a person. there's not a person who doesn't have an uncle who is loud, obnoxious, and love to make fun of the kids in front of the adults. God knows I had it. Hey,
Oh,
I
yeah.
am that uncle now, married to my nieces back in
Okay.
Massachusetts, right? So there we go.
Sure.
But that's how he was. Huge temper. There's that great story how because Beauregard was raised Catholic and
Yeah.
he went to St. Louis Church in Louisiana to get his first communion. And as he's walking up the aisle, he gets halfway, stops, turns, and runs out of the church full speed in front of everybody to the absolute misery of his family watching it.
Yep.
And you, for who knows why, he did make the communion 2 years later, but it's those stories as humans that anybody who's a parent or anybody who, has been around kids can associate with.
Yeah. Well, and I think it just makes them more human and gets away from them being just like these guys that appear in 1860 and disappear in 1865. They have lives before, they have lives after. And what happens to them before is going to affect them during the Civil War. And what happens to them in the Civil War is going to play into decisions they make afterwards. So it's good to study their entire lives to have a better understanding of them. Glow Jam says, nice t-shirt to you.
Oh yeah, we got this from Rob Dalby. He gave me this from Pennsylvania. One of our listeners gave me this. Yeah, that's definitely pretty much sums up the life right there. I can't wait for baseball. By the way, I'm so sick of this cold. Spring training, Mary.
It's a nice day
My Red Sox are undefeated. They're going all the way.
I don't know how Cleveland's doing. I haven't even looked.
Probably eliminated already.
Probably stuck.
No, but as you study these people as people, and that's what you don't want to. And this is where you get in trouble sometimes. You try to diagnose people as far as their personalities and people. There's no documentation for that. Where the hell we got in a conversation with somebody recently about Rosecrans. Remember this like a couple of days ago. What?
It was Ty last.
The thing we went to Gettysburg last weekend. We were talking about Rosecrans, about the concept of him having PTSD.
Yeah, and Ty agreed with us. He was like,
and so we talked about his aide getting killed, and how you can see from that point on his record kind of fell apart.
Yeah.
And you'll say that on some of these serious Facebook pages or Twitter or whatever the hell it's called now, and people will jump all over you because you're no doctor, but I mean it makes sense of it, and because if you get that in your head and you study people like him, a lot of it's his decisions kind of make sense afterwards. And and I'm not by no means I probably need a psychologist more than I am a psychologist, Mary. not question that, but I think it makes them you can understand a lot of the decisions later on.
Yeah, they're humans in the same way that we're humans today, and stuff is going to affect them. I mean, Sherman does not have a great day at Missionary Ridge, but one of the reasons for that is likely because he's just lost his oldest son and he's not over it. There's a really heartbreaking letter he writes to one of his friends, and he's saying, I don't know how I'm going to get through this.
Look at Longstreet losing all those kids in the summertime. No question about that. I mean, just because it wasn't diagnosed doesn't mean it didn't exist,
Yeah, Thomas Carroll's on here, and he said, I couldn't imagine the PTSD that came out of the Civil War.
I mean, the country still has PTSD as a whole. It does, but you're going to tell me? I mean, they called it shell shock later on, and I don't think it was really even officially diagnosed as a real illness till like 60, 70 years ago, I think.
Wasn't Rufus Dawes the first?
Well, they said that somebody went back and read Rufus Dawes and said, this dude clearly, his mental tread in his tire is bald. And if you read his memoirs, he wrote in real time, you can see it. He goes from literally wanting to fight the world to every time someone dropped a book, he would jump. And every time he heard a death story, he would cry his eyes out.
Yeah.
That's a 180. Okay.
Yeah.
So you look at him, it clearly is the case. And it's sad because a lot of these people, most people didn't grow up to be soldiers. None of these guys are Beauregards. They grew up. Elijah Hunt Rhodes talks a lot about it in his diary, where he basically did it because he wanted an adventure. He wanted to leave Rhode Island, which I don't blame him for that, Mary. Just saying, right? But he ends up kind of understanding the whole plight of it. And after First Manassas, when I realized that there was going to be more than blood in just the lady's thimble or on the handkerchief, where that quote is, that these people were in it. And and so it's when Pete Carmichael. By the way, his birthday is today. Happy birthday to our friend Pete Carmichael. Unfortunately, who passed away.
Yeah. Yeah.
So happy birthday. Looking down on us. He
Yeah.
writes his book, The War for the Common Soldier, and if you read it, that book is fantastic because it's all stories about the mental aspect of fighting in the war on both sides. So
Yeah.
if you want to read a book on something like that, read his book because it's just fantastic.
Yeah. And James mentioned that they noticed the effects of war in Crimea. Florence Nightingale noticed it. But I remember back when we did our episode about McClellan, that the one thing, because he was over watching the war in Crimea, he was over there at the time, and he witnessed stuff that just, he saw the brutality of war, and he carried that back with him. And it's not written down, this is just my opinion. Like, I think it affected how he was as a commander, that he didn't want to see those men go through that. I think that factors into some of how McClellan is, because he's witnessed that. And he cared so much about those soldiers. And I think that, just kind of it was in his mind, that he didn't want to see them ripped apart the way he'd seen in the Crimea.
Well, think about it. They learned don't drink the green water at Corinth, right? They learned that the hard way.
Yeah.
Certainly. I mean, they knew they knew these things were happening, but they didn't know what they were. I mean, don't forget too, if you got a concussion, they thought you were drunk, right?
Yeah.
So you must get a lot of concussions, Mary. Just anyway. But I'm just saying that so they didn't recognize this stuff till later. So you read about Hooker being drunk at Chancellorsville. Well, he took one on the noggin.
He was concussed really bad, and I don't think he really came out of that until Lookout Mountain.
No, he got his tower buzzed pretty hard.
Yeah,
sitting at the Chancellor House, and so when you see that, it makes sense. Now there are other stories. The dudes were clearly drunk. Iverson up the street here is the one where they were saying to watch him throw back Grandpa's old cough medicine behind the old Forney farm here, getting ready, But that's the thing is so it's easy to lose your manliness to the men, and if you're having a psychological issue.
Yeah,
I mean, think of the Taylor brothers here. Speaking of Gettysburg.
Yeah.
Henry and Isaac over there, first Minnesota. Yeah. He ends up burying his brother on July 2nd.
Yeah.
And he talks about it. And he was never the same after that. No, I mean, how could you be? How could you be,
And then MJ says the scene in Glory where Shaw reacted to the window closing, thinking it was the sound of battle. And then Thomas mentions, that's why I always enjoyed the Red Badge of Courage. It doesn't dive into the full effects, but it certainly helps paint a picture.
Yeah, there's no question. I mean, because they knew that there was something different about them. And they did, there was no, again, they just didn't know they didn't know. I mean, you didn't have vaccines, you didn't have any of this stuff right now. No. Anything to help even kill a fever. I mean, how many people could have survived the war if they had Tylenol? Yeah. You know what I mean? And so that's part of it. But again, you're fighting this on a day-to-day basis, and is the common soldier living this. Yeah. I can only imagine how miserable Corinth must have been when they all had typhoid and dysentery. Can you imagine? Yeah.
And Beauregard realizes, I have to get these men away from here because it's killing the army.
And they didn't know what the hell it was. Everyone's sick, and so it's sad. But he's able to get that entire army out of Dodge, primarily because Halleck was slow with the switch, taking the whole month of May to get his shit together. But again, he ended up getting them out of there. He felt that was one of his biggest achievements, was saving that army. I mean, think about it. Think if you're a parent, you have a sick kid, you got to go pick up at school and bring them home. How miserable that is. Picture you got thousands of men, you got to deal with that. And you're being fired upon.
Yeah.
And you're in Mississippi of all places.
Richard said Hooker at Chancellorsville is Lindros versus the Devils in 97.
Oh, yeah. Good guess in 97. Good Devils talk. That's when the Devils came out of nowhere, when they had that defense,
I vaguely remember that. But yeah, Hooker at Chancellorsville Hooker is Hooker. I do like him. I think he deserves a bit of a better reputation than what he has, but
Hooker?
He does. He doesn't really come out of that until, like I said, Lookout Mountain. Like, I think that's when he kind of has that's like his redemption. And then Grant is like, well, it's pure romance. And Hooker's like, well, I'm going to have a painting commissioned. And so he does.
I grew up in Massachusetts, and Hooker was one of the heroes.
Yeah.
I mean, but understand too, you protect your own. I grew up in the shadow of Nathaniel Banks Elementary School,
Yeah.
right down in Bank Square in Waltham. He's a superstar. He's not a superstar. Anybody, any Civil War historian's, mind. Red River is a disaster. The Valley's a disaster. He has his moments,
Yeah.
around Vicksburg. But again, you're always going to protect your own.
Yeah.
You're not going to look back on these people. That's why the statues everywhere. They take care of
Well,
their
Hooker's
people.
got that cool statue at the State House.
The best part about it is it's right with this is the Hooker entrance
The
to the
General Hooker and
General Hooker entrance to the state capitol. We always use a joke. That's where all the ugly hookers went. The hot hookers went on the back. That's where the general hookers went in.
the General.
That was always the joke up in Boston. But again, yeah, that's the thing. No question.
Richard asked, did the school have a good commissary?
Absolutely, absolutely. Someone kept taking all the food, but it was good. But Banks was someone again. He was all. I mean, he was a political general, and he was appointed. And that's the whole thing too. But yeah, Nathaniel Banks. I mean, I didn't go to. I went to Northeast Elementary, which turned to JFK Elementary. But I have a lot of friends with Nathaniel Banks Elementary School. And they never knew who he was. They still don't tell people back there anymore.
I went to a school named after Queen Victoria.
Oh yeah, that's such a surprise.
Yeah, Victoria Public.
Yeah, but again, the people are people, and there's no difference speaking to Beauregard, because I mean, if I were him, I think the same way too. He had a superiority complex. He did.
Who, Banks did?
No, Beauregard did.
Yeah. Oh, yeah,
but you can't blame him for it. I mean, when you're raised to be the man and everything you do at the beginning, and the thing about it though is people tend to look at 1863. You tend to focus on Gettysburg. You tend to focus on Vicksburg.
Yeah.
You tend to focus on things like that. But no one thinks about Charleston except for the movie Glory, right?
Yeah.
But by the time 1863 summer was rolling on, everything was going wrong for the Confederates except Charleston with Beauregard.
Yeah.
He had defended Fort Sumter. You're dealing with naval assaults by Samuel DuPont. Gilmore's land attack we talked about. He's able to sneak all the guns away to Castle Pinckney, Fort Moultrie, to defend the inner harbor. So Charleston was defended while everything was going bad. So you saw he was this big superstar at the beginning. He fell down, but then his star was on the rise again.
Yeah.
Because everyone was losing except him. And then people are like, well, you know what? This guy does just win. So maybe we'll put him back in charge again. But again, he any success he has, he embellishes it. He goes to the media saying that it was not a bigger win because of Davis. And he names Davis and Lee by name.
Yeah.
And that's the thing too, is that instead of filing,
he's like blatantly made.
Instead of filing post-battle action reports like you're supposed to, he's giving them to the newspaper and doesn't even message Davis. And the thing that got him was he was always sick. We mentioned before.
Yeah.
And he had the strep throat, or he had a throat thing that lasted forever. Again, there was no antibiotics, so it probably was strep. And he ends up going to Mobile, Alabama, for a vacation, and doesn't tell anybody. He puts Bragg in charge of his army and says, I'm not feeling well. I'm going to go to Mobile and eat and drink with the elites and have a party and just be a superstar in Mobile.
Yeah.
Finally, Davis finds out about it. Like, not for nothing, dude, but what the hell are you doing? You never put in for a furlough or anything like that. He's like, whatever. Bragg's in charge. I'm just kicking it. I'm just chilling. And Davis like, you got me. And so he's like, every time I put you in a situation to do well, you trip on yourself.
Yeah.
And he's like, yeah, well, I am. That's what I'm doing. So deal with it. What are you going to do about it? And then he gets fired. Then he gets fired again.
Yep. The number of times he gets fired. Bill Pike said he went to Plimpton School. Elementary.
Really? Plimpton? That's my friend Bobby Gorman went there. Plimpton School.
Bobby? Oh, is he the one with the kids?
We had a field day one time nearby a place called Leary Field where I had my football glory, one catch my entire years, and we had a field day, and Northeast had a big dodgeball. I don't think you even do dodgeball anymore on that field against Plimpton. It ended up in a big fight with all the kids. We were probably like sixth grade. Somebody got hit in the face, and it was So Plimpton, yeah. I don't know if Plimpton even still exists anymore. I know they consolidated schools in Waltham, but yeah. But in any case, yeah. So Plimpton, yeah.
I was just
So,
gonna say, speaking of Charleston, February 17th was the 160th anniversary of the evacuation of Charleston, South Carolina. And
mhm,
also on February 17th, it was the 160th anniversary of Columbia being burned.
yeah. I mean, 64, I mean, 2025 here, it's going to be obviously the end of the 160th. We're coming,
Yeah.
we're coming into it now. But I mean, there's been a lot of 2024 was a good anniversary year for a lot of
Yeah, we had
people.
like Atlanta, you had Chattanooga, all that. And I didn't see, I mean, I'm not on like and as many Civil War Facebook pages as I once was. In fact, I think I'm only on like two or three.
I think I'm down to one or two at most.
Didn't see much on like the burning of Columbia. And I thought like,
No,
well, usually it's a big deal. But that's an interesting one too, when Columbia is burned, because Sherman realizes that when he's on his Carolinas campaign, he's like, I don't know if I'm gonna be able to keep my men in check in this part, because this is where secession happened. And he always said this was always more important to me than the March to the Sea, was the Carolinas. The Carolinas was what made him nervous. I mean, March to the Sea made him nervous too, because they'd never done anything like that before. But the Carolinas was more, this is where it's going to get real. Don't know if I can keep my men in check for it.
yeah.
And wasn't it Schimmelfennig who went to Charleston?
Yeah, he's the one. He's the one who ultimately took Charleston. I mean, at that point, it was a shell of itself. I mean, everybody
Yeah.
was gone. Once Sherman passed, there was no reason to defend it anymore. That thing was fun. I mean, the horse was out of the barn at that point anyway.
Yeah.
And that's just the way it was.
But Charleston was one where like you still hear the blame game. Was it Wade Hampton who lit everything on fire? Was it Sherman's guys? Um, like Howard has, I think, his telling of Charleston is he's blaming the Union guys for it, but he also says, okay, as bad as we were, there were guys in the Union doing good. There were guys that were helping families get their stuff out of their houses and take it elsewhere. That we weren't all like burning everything. There were those of us that would, and he wanted to make sure that the ones that were helping got the credit for it. And then it was Howard who was put in charge of Charleston by Sherman, because you needed to have an adult in the room. And when they left Charleston, Howard made sure they had, how many cows was it?
It was a couple hundred. It was a lot, and he left weapons too. He left muskets.
Yeah, so they could defend themselves, because Sherman's philosophy behind it, as well as like his two commanders, Slocum and Howard, was that these people need to be our friends again, and we have to be friendly to them. We can't just ransack their town and be like, all right, goodbye, good luck. We have to leave them with some level of stability and protection.
Well, I mean, again, I think at that point, anything post Atlanta, you realize, okay, this is
Yeah.
coming towards the end here. We need to try to, and speaking of McClellan, that was always his big bugaboo too. I don't think he ever realized the war was going to go as long as it did.
No one
And,
did.
and there was, there's all kinds of stories about him, about how because he was a Democrat, he was not a anti-slavery guy, and he hated the Emancipation Proclamation, hated it. And there was a story. What the hell was his name? His last name was Key, like a key. And he came out with a theory later, because he was at the Battle of Antietam, that in his opinion, he wanted McClellan the war to continue just long enough until the North sued for peace, so the South can keep slavery.
Yeah.
And that was that. It ended up being, has a big issue internally. He got called to Washington for it, to meet with Lincoln and talk about it. It was just his opinion, because he never understood why they just couldn't win the war with McClellan, why he was perpetually keeping it going.
Yeah.
And that was his. It never went anywhere. I read a story not too long ago. I was doing some Antietam stuff recently, and that came up, and it's just a fascinating story.
Well, I think like, too, I shouldn't say that no one thought it would be a long drawn out war. Sherman did, and so did Thomas Jackson. They both thought, they're like, well, this is going to be a long time. And so did someone that I was just reading in the Lee biography by Gelzo. He was trying to so Lee struggled to get his wife to leave Arlington. He's like, you need to leave because the troops are going to be there. And she's like, no, I'm not going to. And all she did was tend to her gardens. Like she just ignored it. And then finally she realized like, well, I better leave. And it was after Lee wrote this letter where he's like, you know what, this is going to be a long war, perhaps several years. So prepare yourself for that. And she finally left. And then she was all like, she was pretty angry when she realized like she's not getting back on the property. Once
Yeah.
the guy, once they occupied it, she's like, I'm not getting back on this property. And she was livid about it.
So, so
Um,
did you play dodgeball in elementary school?
yeah,
Did you? I bet. You know,
yeah.
I remember one time, when we thinking about this, elementary school in a while. My friend Chris, real big, fat, big, strong guy. He was one of those traditional fat kids in school, and we used to pick teams, and he was always picked last because usually it was dodgeball,
Yeah, that was me.
right? And so one day, everyone picked the team, and Chris was picked last again. And the teacher says, "Guess what? We're going to do tug of war today." And everyone's like, "Oh my god!" And then Chris killed everybody. From that point
Wow.
on, he always got picked in the middle because we never knew what we were going to play.
Wow.
There you go.
Jeffrey says, great talk today, guys. Heading off. Last thing, just want to give a shout out to the awesome 1863 design Spore Breakfast of 11th Core Howard sticker and coffee mug. Thank you,
Yes,
Jeffrey.
thanks. I
That's our friend
appreciate that.
Ty that is designing those for us, and he's awesome. He does
And,
great work.
and that there's going to be T-shirts and hoodies coming out soon. We saw the design for the T-shirt last night. It's going to be really, really cool. It's going to
Yeah,
have all the battles in the back of the court and some Bruce Springsteen type work. So Ty is
yeah.
the man. He's the best. So check out that site. And again, we don't see a
He's
nickel
on
from this.
Etsy.
We donate all the stuff to different things, so we don't see a nickel out of that. But I'm glad that he's doing that because it's great work. So definitely get the stickers, or at least anyway.
If
They're
anyone
fun.
wants to check out 1863 designs, I'm going to post the link in the chat or in the comments. All right. Oops. There we go. Post it in there. So there's a link in there. Ambrose asked, when Kansas troops were in the South, many of them acted similar to the Union in South Carolina because they felt that the South had fueled the war. Do you think there was any evidence for Southern troops being antagonistic to Kansas for feeling as if they started the war?
I'm sure there were. I mean, I can't think of a case on the top of my head, but I mean, Kansas was a situation where when you look even all the way back to the John Brown days, there was always something to it. These guys would find excuses to blame anybody at this point, and not everybody in the South was a Confederate. There were, Free State of Jones, for example. There was always a little bit. A lot of the stuff of Kansas, stuff like Delaware, Maryland, that all came out after the war, and a lot of it was woe begotten stuff. Is how that
Yeah.
was. But again, most of the people, at least when you read the initial diaries, they tend to think more of South Carolina more,
Yeah.
and they think of Virginia. Even guys like Sam Houston in Texas were not fans of the Confederacy.
No, he's like, we can't do this.
And
Like,
so,
this is bad.
I can't. That's a great question. I can't think of a situation off the top of my head, but I'm sure they did. But I think they were more front of mind. I think because Sumter they were fired on,
Yeah.
and I think they saw that as open war versus bloody Kansas and stuff like that. But people blame John Brown for Harper's Ferry still for the war.
Yep.
Melville called him the meteor. So he
Yep.
says that the war really began at Harper's Ferry. So there are people who probably associated back with bloody Kansas as the beginning too.
Yep. Oh, I think that's definitely true. Frank says that it was Major Halleck's staff with John Key, who you were talking about.
John Key, yeah, it was John Key.
And Lincoln dismissed him shortly after Antietam for talking about letting the South keep their slaves if the war was prolonged.
Yeah. It's an interesting study when you read this, because there's a lot of trying to figure out the situation with McClellan, trying to get in his head to see what his game was about. Because if you study Antietam, you really get into the muck with Antietam, you realize it's almost like it's like a football coach. You're up big, and instead of running the ball, you're just running high risk plays, almost like you're trying to get the other team back into it again to have a victory by that much. Like he didn't want to like put their junk in the dirt. He wanted to win, slap them across the face and send them on their way. And it ticked a lot of people off. And when you realize the opportunity he had, basically right around the time when the Sunken Road happened, when you got Fitz-John Porter, the fifth corps, and you had the Sixth Corps, they're kind of sitting there in the bullpen. And the fact that he never used his cavalry at any point, he stayed way the hell back with his horses when they're trying to find Snavely Ford and the Ninth Corps in the South to try to flank them, and he doesn't even use his cavalry. It's almost like, what are we doing here? Like, are you even trying? but that's always been the enigma with him. And
Mhm.
we praise McClellan on different things, but you cannot, even his mother would criticize him on how he handled the Battle of Antietam, because it
Yeah,
was almost like he was trying to lose or trying to win close. Like he was just trying to, like the Harlem Globetrotters, trying to let
yeah,
the Washington, you know, generals back in the team in the
yeah,
game at the last minute just to beat them. So yeah, but Key is an interesting read if you read his stuff, because it just makes you think. It just opens your
yeah.
mind up a little bit to it, you know.
Yeah, and I think too, like with McClellan, and I know we've taken hits for this before, saying we're like apologists, which I don't think we are. I think we're trying to tell his full story and say like you need to look at get out of that what Stephen Sears has said about him and read some of the other sources to understand him more. Is he arrogant? Absolutely,
No,
he
but
is.
there's a
Okay.
pig piling on him.
Yes, and there's people
It,
that say like, "Oh, look at the stuff he said about, Lincoln in his letters." It's like, okay, well, the thing with that is they were private at the time, and which one of us does not we all have somebody that is a sounding board. We all have somebody to vent to. It's how I don't know, we do that as humans. That's what McClellan is doing. He never expected those letters to be public consumption, but his wife made them available afterwards. So that's kind of like that's her thing. Whether he would have been happy about that, it's another story. But I saw like, thing about Thomas the other day. Again, we talked about this before, that the reason he asked his wife to burn the letters was because he did not want the media to see them.
right.
Because of, I suspect, certain things that were said about people, that there was probably times where Thomas, as a Virginian, is not accepted completely by Grant or Sherman. And he probably felt the need to vent to his wife, like, well, I'm just suspecting I'm being passed over for command. They're, they don't trust me because I'm a Virginian. He's probably saying um, a lot of stuff that is not good, and he just does not want it read. And I don't blame him for that. Like,
Well,
that's
that would be the difference between Beauregard then, because Beauregard would take these letters and put them in the newspaper.
oh yeah,
He didn't write, his wife Caroline. He didn't really talk too much about until she died um when she died in New Orleans. That was the only time he really ever talked about her. But Beauregard would write letters of telling everyone in the world who he thought sucked, and he
yeah,
would send them to any paper where he was locally to cover his own butt. Versus McClellan kind of did it, but McClellan is just an enigma though, because this is a guy who regularly would find his way all the way to the front door just to realize he lost the key and he couldn't get it. But it was almost like by design. It just was. That's why people still study him today, because he was definitely not into emancipation at all.
yeah,
He hated that. Um, and a lot of people think it's because he wanted to win the war and let the South down slow, and he never realized that even after Antietam, that he wasn't going to work out. Because don't forget too, for the most part, just kind of Beauregard, things were going pretty well for McClellan for the most part. He wasn't part of that second Manassas disaster, and
no,
people rip on him for that, for keeping some of his troops in Washington and letting
yeah,
John Pope swing for that. He gets to Maryland, he has a solid victory, but again, it's not. And that's his words, but it should have the war should have ended the East that day. It should have ended that day. And
yeah,
even with AP Hill arriving from Harper's Ferry and dealing with that whole aspect where the auto farm is,
yeah,
that battle, that part of the battlefield, even with that, he should have gone all in. He should have gone all in, like Billy Madison said, "Let's
yeah.
go."
Oh,
You know, he should have done that. But again, he sat back at the Pry House
yeah,
with his Fifth Corps commander, looking through the telescope, say, "Well, yeah, we're okay." And again, Hooker getting wounded, got shot in the foot. That battle was a big deal
yeah,
too, as was the death of Mansfield, which really wasn't that big of a deal. But there was no command, there was no continuity, there was no communication, there was
yeah,
no one. It was like the Wheatfield here. There was no one in charge. It was just a hodgepodge, and he sat back thinking he was totally in control. He basically won that battle with one arm tied behind his back when he could have
yeah.
been. It should have been. I still think Antietam is the biggest turning point in the Civil War because of the proclamation, but it should have been of that day. He should have caught him before he went over the Potomac. He never should have
Yeah.
got let him go over to Bowles Ford. Never should have happened.
No, I completely agree with that. And there's some people talking about like, David's mentioning Stephen Sears also does not like Howard and a few other people, and he makes it so obvious. Whereas like Sears Reynolds, who I mean, I like John Reynolds, but Sears Reynolds can do no wrong in his eyes. So he's very
Yeah.
and I mean, Sears has his place. Obviously, his book about Antietam is very detailed. His book about Gettysburg, I recommend it to people all the time. It and Trudeau are a great way to get started with Gettysburg. But like you just have to then that, but Sears is a reminder to read more and don't just like pigeonhole yourself into like, well, Sears said this, so he must be correct. You know, like that it's that just why it's so important to read. And I used to be very anti-McClellan, and then I started reading more, and I'm like, well, you know what? This guy is not as bad. I mean, he's not great, but he's not as bad as what people are saying. Richard said that the death of Kearney had a major impact on Antietam as well. Having another fighting general in the field would have made a huge difference.
Well, I mean, honestly, we played this what if game with the whole thing, especially with the Second Corps and stuff like that. But I mean, I don't think Joseph Mansfield in charge of the 12th of Kearney's alive, to be honest. He was sitting at a desk in Washington, wanted field command, and he was in field command literally 2 days before he got killed. And he got killed chasing the 10th Maine into the woods, thinking they were the Confederates, and he got shot. And that was the end of him over in the East Woods. So you again, you look at how these deaths, like him as Chantilly, how Stevens is Chantilly, but especially Kearney, how that might have changed how the Army of the Potomac was set up. Because when you look at guys like Bull Sumner in the Second Corps, is he in charge? I don't know. Hooker was in charge of the First Corps because Reynolds was held back in Pennsylvania because of Governor Curtin. So he was held back. So again, you're fighting with your I don't say your B team, but what you could have had. But Kearney going down was huge, though, because I think we've talked a little about Kearney in the Second Corps. I don't think Mansfield's in charge in team if Kearney's alive, personally. No. But that's just Monday morning quarterback on my end. But again, that's a huge loss for them. Yeah. And again, but knowing McClellan, he might not put him in charge anyway. He might have gone with Mansfield because there's no rhyme or reason to him. I mean, with some of his decisions.
I think, had commander of the AOP written all over him had he not been killed. His loss is as great as Zollicoffer's is in the Confederate side. And you look how early Zollicoffer is lost. We don't talk about him.
Zollicoffer's death changed the entire aspect of the Mississippi, Trans-Mississippi. And no one knows who the hell he is because no one studies that aspect, the theater of the battle. But you're right. Zollicoffer being killed was equal to Kearney being killed in Chantilly, realistically speaking. Because of Zollicoffer getting killed, now Beauregard goes out there. That's how he ends up there, is because of Zollicoffer. People think he was being punished and demoted. No, because Davis needed a strong general to work out there with Sidney Johnson. With Zollicoffer gone, he had no choice but to use Beauregard.
Yeah.
So he got a career move out of that one, and that's just the way it is. I mean, and Lee always respected McClellan as a commander, but he also knew he was slow. And there's that story when Jackson arrives from Harper's Ferry in Antietam because he had just taken the Harper's Ferry garrison. And he arrives and he says, there's stories of, Union in Pleasant Valley in the South Mountain area. And he goes, I thought you told me McClellan was slow. And Lee's like, he's like, well, he kind of was. And so there was that too. But I go all day by Antietam, but it's just one of those things,
Well, Frank said he finished Hartwig's book.
Oh my God, good for you.
That's a monster. He said he feels McClellan did a good job stopping Lee, but he wasn't a risk taker, and he didn't attack Lee after the cross. But
where Sears has his book, The Landscape Turned Red, and where he's wrong is the post battle, and he talks about the Battle of Shepherdstown, and he talks about how Lee was going to fall back, and that was going to be the end of the Maryland campaign, blah blah blah, all that. But the reality, if you talk to a guy like a Tom Clemens, for example, and people who are guys like Matt Borders, for example, they'll remind you that Lee was going to do a U-turn, or as we say in Mass, bang a Huey, right?
Yeah.
He was going to go around and he was going to cross at Williamsport to go into Pennsylvania. And he wasn't falling back after Maryland. He was just going to swing around. But because McClellan had armed the fords, he had no choice but had to fall back. And Sears makes no mention of that. He says that if Lee had basically, paraphrasing, if Lee had attacked in Williamsport, he would have rolled right through. It's like, no, that's why he didn't attack, because he put his cavalry there.
Mhm.
And so again, you have to understand the intent of the author. And he wants to pig pile of McClellan. And he deserves it in a lot of ways. But I mean, you got to be to our own self be true. You still got to call balls and
Yeah.
strikes sometimes, right?
Yeah, but I mean, some of the stuff that he, says about Howard is he goes with that telegram story that Buford, he says Buford was writing it about Howard, saying no one, like, everything's in disarray. We don't know who's in charge. Odds are Buford didn't write that with Howard in mind. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, and I'm not saying that as a person who like, I like Howard, obviously, but like, we don't know for sure. And we've had discussions with people that they have admitted we don't know for sure what that was exactly. And we don't know who he was referring to. Richard McGovern says he just finished a book called To Antietam Creek.
There's a lot of good books about it. In Scott's book, I Dread the Thought of the Place, is actually a quote from Rufus Dawes
Mhm.
when they thought they were going to fight because Gettysburg they thought was going to be in like Manassas, fighting in Antietam again. And when he said that we're going towards Maryland, he said, I dread the thought of the place. That's what. In the Landscape Turned Red, actually, is a quote that Sears uses from a Napoleonic War quote about a soldier talking about the landscape turned red.
Yeah.
And then when the Fourth Rhode Island was fighting through Antietam, they said this is like Napoleon saying a landscape turning red. So it's kind of cool. I come with the titles of some of these, but that's just stupid.
Have you read his Chancellorsville book?
Sears? Yeah, it's probably his best. It's probably his better of the books. His Gettysburg book is pretty good too. I know you like said he doesn't like Howard. Chancellorsville is pretty good. It's pretty solid, I think. Compare. See, Stephen Sears is a fascinating guy because he likes who he likes, he hates who he hates, but he's also somebody where a lot of people, if you're going to read one book and you read his book on Gettysburg, you're going to have a very skewed opinion. Same thing with everything else he does, but it's not bad. I like his writings. I just think that you have to read more than just him to get a full feel to it.
I agree. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I mean, that's why we say like just read as much as you can. Because you're going to become better studied because of that, especially, somebody like Beauregard, who's got this biography from the 50s or 60s when T. Harry Williams wrote it. But there has been, I think, an updated one from Emerging Civil War, which I need to read. But it's just important to just study this stuff as much as you can, and don't get pigeonholed with one battle or one person because they all like flow in one into the other. Just like we talked about how the reason Pemberton gets sent to Vicksburg is because of Davis's beef with Beauregard.
Yeah. I mean, it just goes to show that these personal animosities affect decisions. And, Governor Pickens in South Carolina loved Beauregard because of his experience with Fort Sumter, loved Beauregard. He hated Pemberton, who he felt was a complete incompetence. And they
he's not wrong there.
No, but they kind of maneuvered a trade, and it was a marriage of convenience. Well, you know something? I'll give you the guy you like. I'll take your guy out of there. But I don't think he realized he was putting one of the top 5 all-time incompetent Confederates into one of the top 3 most strategic places in the battlefield at Vicksburg.
Yeah.
So again, it goes to show that sometimes you can be clouded. You can hate someone so much that you look beyond, you can cut off your nose and spite your face. That old phrase goes, right?
Yeah.
And that's what happened with Pemberton. And that's how he ends up in Vicksburg, not because he earned the right to defend a strategic bend in the river in Vicksburg, Mississippi. It's because he hated Beauregard.
Yeah.
How history changed. I mean, I don't think Napoleon's going to defend Grant against. Let's call a spade with this, but Grant's plan was brilliant to take that eventually.
Yeah.
But again, if somebody was in there who was probably more competent than Pemberton, I don't know if it would turn out differently, but it might have lasted longer.
Yeah.
What
would you recommend to read on Chancellorsville beyond Sears?
I don't know. I mean, the thing about it, Sears is probably the best overall book. I can't think off the top of my head.
Gary Gallagher has a collection of essays that he edited, which is one, and I think Savas Beatty published one as well. like I need to read more about Chancellorsville.
I
I've
mean,
read like a couple articles and stuff about it, and Sears's book, obviously.
if you read Sears, you're going to get a very, very detailed aspect of it all.
Yeah.
Okay, you're going to get the whole march from Fredericksburg. Okay, you're going to get the Battle of Salem Church. You're going to get the Orange Plank Road battles. You're going to get all of that. If you read some of the other stuff coming out, it's going to jump right to Chancellorsville. The thing I will say this about Sears is his lead up to the battle is fantastic on all of his books. If you're gonna read his book on Antietam, you're not even going to get to Antietam until a quarter way through, because you're going to get Maryland campaign, you're going to get Turner's Gap, you're going to get Fox's Gap, you're going to get all of that.
Yeah.
And the same thing with Gettysburg. You're going to get the whole shooting match, June 3rd up, and it's the same way with Chancellorsville.
Yeah.
If you are going to read one book on it, or a good book, that probably is the best. I think it's one of these ones here, but it's one of the better reads.
Yeah. And there's this one by Gallagher was from 2009, and it's got like politics in the Union Army and different stuff, impact of the war on children, the state of battlefield medical care, and it's just essays that are looking at Chancellorsville. And Gary Gallagher wrote one for it. Carol Reardon, John Hennessy wrote one for it as well, but it's got a collection of essays as well. So that's another one. But yeah, definitely like Sears is a great place to start because he's so detailed. But then afterwards, like check out the Gary Gallagher book with the essays.
What is good about the Sears book about Chancellorsville is you can read that book, and when you go to visit it, the battlefield, you can. He talks about Catherine Furnace, for example. He talks about Hazel Grove. He talks about all these things. When you go, it's there. He's very detailed. What's ironic about Sears is a lot of these battlefields he's never visited.
Yeah.
He's written a lot of these books without visiting the field. And I know the Antietam book, he never visited Antietam.
No.
And if you read the book and you read the details about how he talks about the Roulette Farm, and he talks about Poffenburg Farm, he talks about Nicodemus Hill and places like that.
Yeah.
It's amazing he can get the detailing right for someone who hasn't been there. But if you read his book and you go to visit the battlefield, you'll feel like you know it, because he does do a good job explaining it. But again, he hates Howard there too. He talks about the 11th Corps thing. It is what it is. But it's good to read. It's a good book though.
Okay. They're all. I mean, all these books have a place in studying the Civil War. No matter when they were published or whatever. But just there's obviously new research that comes out all the time. Stuff is found. I know a few years ago somebody found like a whole bunch of like primary source documents that completely changed how we look at Slocum at Gettysburg, that it looks at him now in a more positive light.
That stuff's always going to come. That's what's great about history, is we've said it's not black and white. It's always gray. Yeah. Like we were saying to Makowski that time when we were on his thing, every historian is one found letter away from oblivion, of completely blowing their entire point of view, because that's how history is. You're writing your interpretation of whatever you're studying. But if something new comes out that dispels it, you better have an open mind. You better not be so set in your ways, you know what I mean, that you think you know everything, because no one knows everything, and you got to stay humble with history. Yeah, and that's important, But a lot of people aren't like that, as you know, Mary.
They're not. Frank says we need a Civil War Breakfast Club forum thread to post on all the book recommendations. So our Facebook page is also a forum, so feel free, if you're on our Facebook page, post book recommendations, chat on there. Like you can absolutely do that. Hal Baker's on here from Littleton, Mass.
Oh wow, Littleton, Mass. I told you that's where my godparents are from.
Yeah, you talked to him before about that.
Yeah, Chet and Kathy Capone. Yeah, I think they're both long. I know Chet's dead. I haven't talked to them in years, but it's but that's a cool little place.
I was going to say
we just go apple picking there a lot, Mary. We just go there all the time.
Apple picking.
Oh yeah.
So my white whale in this right now is to find the letter that the high-ranking officer wrote to Howard telling him to leave the 11th Corps after Chancellorsville, because Howard does not give up his name. And that's one thing about that's one thing that annoys I shouldn't say annoys me about Howard, but he's almost like he won't give up names when I want the names. Like he hints at it.
Well, that's the problem with him, and that's a very main characteristic about him, is he's got that New England sarcastic wit to him, but he won't throw anybody under the bus.
No, the worst thing he says is he basically says, Hood sucks to his look. He's like, he sucks.
Yeah, he didn't like
He's terrible.
Hood. He
He
definitely
did
didn't.
not like Hood at all. He's like, he's not a good commander. He sucks. Like that's the only time he really insults somebody. Um, Even when Hooker was going at him after he left the Western Theater, Howard's writing his wife and saying, so just so you know, Hooker left here and he's not very happy because I'm in charge of the Army of the Tennessee and he feels he should have got it because he's higher ranking than me. And he's likely going to go to the newspapers.
Well, I mean, we saw that with the Beauregard episode
Yep.
we just did. Was Bragg hated him initially because of a rumor that he thought that Beauregard, because he was the first brigadier general named in the Volunteer Army, that
Yep.
he was put in charge of all armies in the Confederacy, and it wasn't. But he had that in his head,
Mhm.
and naturally, right off the bat, it became a rivalry to it. And one
Yep.
guy, in as much as I think someone asked about the troops before, but there were a lot of generals, specifically guys like James Longstreet, who really liked Beauregard.
Yeah.
They just really did. And Longstreet was somebody who wanted him to be part of his army when he was out there.
Yeah.
Because he liked Beauregard. He felt that he was a good soldier, and it just never happened because the hate with Davis, he was not going to do anybody any favors.
No.
But Lee didn't like him. Obviously, Davis hated him. Again, he was Robert E. Lee before Robert E. Lee is how he was in the South, and he lost that title, and he didn't like it. He's just always felt that he was. If you listen to me, I don't know why we're losing. And you get sick of hearing it after a while. Could you imagine? And it was before you're sitting in Chattanooga, and everything you're trying is failing. You get a letter from him saying, "If you want to win, do this." How ticked off that would make you if you were Braxton Bragg. But he didn't do it maliciously. He literally thought, I'm trying to help. But no one likes that person who says, well, you should do this. If your job's having a tough time, have you tried doing this? That's what I would do. That's how he was.
And Durant said the 11th Corps was despised, but they fought well at Chattanooga. David Maxwell says a lot of feelings about the 11th Corps were pure discrimination because there were so many Germans. And sadly, that is the case, that there was a lot of discrimination towards them. And what happened to them at Chancellorsville is terrible. But it carries forward into Gettysburg, unfortunately, to the point where they aren't seen as fighting very well. Yet they do.
Well, I mean, to a point, but I mean, Wainwright, the artillerist, was, he was very clear saying, guys like Winslow and his battery up there, East Cemetery Hill, if it gets ugly here, the Germans are going to run.
And he was specifically referencing von Gilsa.
Von Gilsa, and what happens? They run.
Well, von Gilsa ran at Chancellorsville too.
Right.
But you look at them up on, Barlow's Knoll or Blocher's Knoll, as it was called back then. They had, like Gordon said, they fought hard there.
No, and a lot of the top level history stories about the second night at Gettysburg, they talk about Samuel Carroll from the Second Corps, but they don't talk about Shizanovsky. So it wasn't just him who helped infantry to help stem the tide while the Confederates, Avery and Hayes's guys, were coming up the hill at night there. But again, it's a narrative. It's a narrative. Yeah. And people in this country are still not very accommodating to foreigners. They never have been. And that was the same case during the Civil War. And it's all perpetuated by the diaries. You read Wainwright's diary. I mean, he does not like the Germans. No, it doesn't. And that sticks.
Yeah. But when they do go to the Western Theater, they have success. They're very good at Chattanooga.
Well, sometimes a change of scenery helps, right?
I think it did. I mean, Carl Schurz he does really well out there too. Yeah. And he kind of, we've been to his grave before, which is really cool, in Sleepy Hollow.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you can be really good at what you do, and you're still not going to win. Sometimes you need to change. That's why Josh Allen needs to get the hell out of Buffalo. He wants a ring. You get the hell out of there. He ain't winning there. But that's just the way it is, though. And you saw with Howard, you saw with a lot of these guys.
Slocum is another one too.
I think that's a big reason why Longstreet did want Beauregard with him, because you saw Beauregard for what he was. Longstreet was no offensive genius either. He was more of a defensive guy, but he did appreciate strategy and did appreciate the engineers. And Beauregard was probably their best engineer. He was probably a top 3 strategist. He was right up there with Lee with strategy, as far as X's and O's. But again, Beauregard, whenever the situation fell in his face, it was never his fault, or he tried to spin it.
Yeah.
He never did the whole, it is all my fault, like Lee did. Although Lee
Yeah,
flipped that around a few weeks later, but
yeah, he
that's
did.
just the way it is. But I mean that's the truth though. And as you study these guys, you can see how their personalities directly affect their performance.
Yeah.
You know,
Oh,
it's true.
completely. Yeah, completely agree with that. Like,
You know,
should we get ready to jump off here soon?
yeah, I got a thing to do this afternoon. Ugh,
Yeah.
it'll be fun. Anyway, all right. So what's coming up for us? We just did the episodes. We got to
We
figure
need
out the
to
next one.
talk about what our next episodes are going to be. We need to settle on a date for the roundtable. And yeah, and we do have for anyone in the area, March 22nd, we are going to be at Getty's Gear with a whole bunch of other great presenters. And we are going to be Darren and I are going to be talking about the Battle of Bentonville at Getty's Gear. They're doing an event which is all day, talks about the Civil War, starts at 9 o'clock. We are the ones kicking it off. Yay to go first.
Yeah, well, we'll get that done. So we'll do that. But no, it's it's great. I mean, if you're in town, we did the event last week with Getty's here, the trivia, and that was a lot of fun. If
Yeah.
you're in town and they do a whole bunch of stuff, we talk about them a lot, but it's the place to buy your cigars, all your knickknacks, all your coffee. And they're great. It's a great local company. They don't sell Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks or anything like that. It's
No, they got awesome coffee.
everything's internal. So
Yeah.
but that's yeah, it's fun though. But yeah, now we should go. Now we have to go to Cemetery Hill now. We haven't been up there in a while.
Well, that's what Hal brings up. You told the story once on the live park ranger story from Cemetery Hill, or Culp's Hill, where a Confederate claimed a gun, and the gunner replied in German, the equivalent of "Then you shall have it."
Etsa Suhaben. That's a cool story. That's what it was. So he comes up the hill and it was like he runs up and he grabs the gun and says, "I capture this gun on the Confederacy. Give this to me now." And he was German. He yells, "That's what happened. I mean, you will have it," and pulled the lanyard and blew him into a million places.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you read some of the letters of East Cemetery Hill, what's great about that is they talk about it so flowery and it's very unintentionally funny of the way they describe that. But yeah, that's how it was. And some brutal fighting, absolutely brutal fighting. So it's definitely a place to go. So
yeah, anyway, just confirming for William Hammond, he said what day? It's March 22nd, Saturday.
Yeah, March 22nd. It's a full day thing. I think we have it pinned on one of the social media things. I don't even know, to be honest, but we'll definitely do that. And so there's a lot of cool people doing that. So check that out. But if you're in the area and you're looking for cigars or coffee or anything, just go in there and you just sit in the back. They have a TV on. You can just watch some stuff back there. They're great people. I mean, you know what? Life is great because there are good people in it, and they are good people.
They're really.
And what's fortunate about this town, it's a classic small town USA, is that you have a lot of people who look out for each other here, and they're definitely people who you want to do that. So, anyways, that's cool. So we'll have a good time with that. And if you have any questions, go see Carrie, go see Janet, go see Kat. She runs the Atomic Cider in the back. Their
she
daughter,
works for them too.
Yeah, no, it's all good. It's all good people. It's all good people. So, all right. So why don't we jump off? We got stuff we got to do. So yeah, listen to the episode if you like Beauregard, if you don't like Beauregard. But I think it's fun to study these folks to get a good idea of who they are, and we try to capture their personality so people can kind of get a gist of what they're like. But I think he's a fascinating guy.
Oh, I do too.
And you cannot help come away of realizing how much he is Confederate McClellan in so many different ways. And there are a lot of guys like that, but it's so common. It's just so hilarious, But anyway, so.
Yep. William said, fantastic meeting as usual. Thanks for what you do. Yeah. Thank you everyone for coming on here with us and commenting and just hanging out with us. We really enjoy doing these. We probably won't be on next weekend, but hopefully the weekend after that. We just have some stuff going on next weekend. Thank you, Hal. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, MJ.
Yeah, if we do it, it'll be Sunday. It won't be Saturday.
Yeah.
Because there's some stuff going on Saturday. So I'll be out in Pittsburgh Saturday, Mary.
Mm-hmm.
Watching my Bruins probably lose to the Penguins, but that's a different story. But that'll be fun. So we'll do that. So definitely thank you for jumping on, everybody. And yeah, we appreciate it. Enjoy your Sunday. As the weather is warming up. It's a great day to hit the battlefield, Mary. Just saying.
It is. Yeah. So I think that's what we're gonna do.
So we'll get into that pretty soon. All right, off we go. Everybody have a great weekend. Stay warm, stay dry, and we'll talk